so today we're going to be finishing up our painting of these kids at the ocean. So what we're going to do first is we're going to use our masking fluid pen to mask off the areas we want to stay white. So the most important areas are going to be like the foam of the ocean, as well as some little highlights and the ocean that's farthest away from the kiddos. So you can kind of see some little spurts. Now you don't have to put it everywhere. Like what's going to make the sea foam look more three-dimensional is having some gray shadows in here, and mostly keeping the white up at the very top of the foam. So when I'm using my masking fluid, you want to make sure you shake it really well with the lid on. Then I'm going to pump it on a spare piece of paper just to test it, because some masking fluid markers, as they start running out, it may get more sticky on top of your painting. So you want to be really careful with that. So, and with the sea foam, I'm just kind of randomly scumbling in some little bits of highlights. And then I'll do some longer highlights for in this back ocean, which kind of looks like the sky. For our next part, since I have most of what I want masked off, I'm gonna go ahead and start painting my sky, just because it's a lighter color than my ocean, and I can always paint my ocean on top of it if I mess up on my sky. Also, typically on a painting, you wanna work background to foreground, but we are gonna jump around a little bit. Like I'm gonna paint the sky, and then we'll probably jump down and start blocking in on some of the kids, just because we want to reflect some of those colors when we paint this ocean down here, because it's a reflection. So I'm going to use a size 12 brush, which is a round brush, and I want to make a soft sky color. So instead of using like a phthalo blue, instead I want to use ultramarine blue. Or even if you have like cerulean blue. So this is what my ultramarine blue looks like by itself. And then I'm gonna wash off my paintbrush and grab a little cerulean, just so y'all can kind of see what it looks like. So cerulean has a little bit more green to it, but a lot of times the brands will actually also mix a little bit of white, so it's already really light. So I'm gonna make some nice puddles of that. And then what I wanna do for my sky is I'm gonna do wet on wet. So what that means is I'm gonna take water and wet the entire sky. And then I'm gonna take my blue, and if I wanted clouds, I'm gonna use the blue just to paint around some cloud shapes like that. Or, I mean, you could just streak in blue and just have like wispy clouds, more like that. So, and our sky is very far away, so it doesn't have to be super detailed. And that's how we're gonna do that. So next we're gonna be mixing the skin tones for our kids at the beach. Now, depending what reference you're using for your kids, or if you want them to look like you or look like your grandkids or someone, will depend what kind of color you're gonna use. Now, kind of a good base for skin when using watercolor is burnt sienna and a lot of water. Now, if someone is more tan, then sometimes I'll use less water and more burnt sienna. If someone has a darker skin tone, then I'll add burnt umber, and that kind of tones it down. Versus if I take burnt sienna with a whole lot of water, that's how you make kind of a peachy skin tone, like that. And then sometimes if someone looks too orange, you'll take the complement, which is like ultramarine blue, but you have to be careful with that because sometimes it will gray it down and you'll end up with a zombie. So I'm just gonna take burnt sienna with a lot of water and add a tiny bit of alizarin. And this will be the base color for my kiddos. So what I'm going to do is just paint a thin wash over the legs. So this is how I can give this girl more of a peachy kind of skin tone, very light and pinky. Oops, that was a little too much water. And I can always suck it up with a dry brush if I get too much water. And I'm using a very small brush. This is a 1, but like a 2 or a 3 would work just as good, just depending how big you painted. And then on my other buddy, I'm going to do just that burnt sienna and a little yellow ochre and a lot of water. So you can kind of see the slight variation I can get with almost the same color. Like this girl looks like she could get sunburned very quickly. And then we'll let that dry and then start adding some of the shade. So while we're waiting for these to dry a little bit, and since, you know, the top part of my kiddos are pretty dry and my sky is dry, I can go ahead and start blocking in this back part of the ocean. Now for the ocean, instead of using like ultramarine blue, typically you want to use more like phthalo blue with a little bit of ultramarine blue, because it's a very nice vibrant and dark blue that's great for oceans. So what I'm going to do on my palette is I'm going to mix up some ultramarine and then phthalo. So because phthalo is very green, so sometimes if you add a little bit of ultramarine blue, it makes it, you know, a little deeper and a little less green, just because ultramarine blue is actually a warmer red. So you kind of make a new blue that way. And what I want to do with my water, I'm using that same brush I was painting with earlier on my sky, the size 12. I'm going to wet my ocean, going side to side. And the tricky part is when you get to your kiddos, you have to go around them. You don't want to wet through them. Another thing is you could mask them off technically if you're really worried about running into them, but I may just try and be careful. And I'm going to take my ocean color, and with water you want to kind of streak in horizontally, and you can leave, even though we masked it off, you can leave some what's called skippets, which is where I don't fill the whole entire thing flat with blue. I can kind of leave some little spaces. And then where I get close to the kiddos, I'm kind of going right up close to them and then pulling away, because you don't want to have a sharp like outline around them. I'm going all the way up to my phone. Oops. And then while it's wet, you can take even more blue and streak it in a little darker. Now, if your paint is really, really wet, you can always wait and then do this next step once it's dry. So, and that'll be one of our first layers for the back ocean. So next, what we're gonna do is jump down to this bottom section of water. Now, this is thinner water where, you know, the wave is receding, you know, or coming in after another wave has already come through. And that's why, you know, we still have a reflection in here, and it's shiny because it's very thin water, but mostly it's going to have some of the sand color showing through. So what I want to do first is I want to make up a sand color Now, if you take yellow ochre with a lot of water and a little bit of burnt sienna, that makes a really great kind of base light sand color. And then you also want to make sure that you have some of your skin tone, because in the water, we're going to have some reflections of their legs. So I want to make sure I remix a little bit of that.
I'm sorry, yellow ochre and burnt sienna?
With a lot of water. And then I also want to have just more of my watercolors on there. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to be wetting the sections first. And since the kids kind of divide the sections, I can do them section by section. I don't have to rush to try and paint this whole thing at once. And I want to start by streaking in my sand. Then I'm going to streak in the reflection of the kiddo legs. That sounds weird. But the skin tone in the water. And it's okay if it's not perfect, because this is a reflection. And what I'm going to do is, instead of jumping to the blue, since this area is very wet, I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and I'm going to start wetting the next section. And I'll do the same thing where I do some sand. Oh no, my sand is too dark, too yellow. That's okay. So then on my other kiddo, got their legs.
Can you drag that into the white mix right there? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Did you wet it all first, or did you do?
Yes, I wet it all first.
Okay. So it's wet and wet.
Mm-hmm. So this is wet on wet, and then after you do the yellow and the skin tone, then you'll start doing the blue. So that's going to help to make sure that the blue, it doesn't become like too green. So I'll just start putting the blue in a little bit, kind of around the yellow almost, so like underneath the foam, and just kind of streaking in some little bits in here. So next what we want to start doing is getting a little bit more value and depth into the area in our foam. So in this area, what I want to do is add a little bit of burnt sienna to my ocean blue. Now it's going to turn a little grayish green, and if I don't really want it that green, I could always just add a little bit of red to it, because red is the complement of green. So it will go more brown though, a little bit purple, but it kind of helps to neutralize it. So I'll put that shadow underneath my foam, but then also, because we don't want our foam to be, you know, just a big mass of white, I'll wet a section of the foam, and then I'll start tapping some of the gray in there, and I'm kind of skipping around. So I'm not trying to fill the whole thing with gray. And then I could also tap in like a little bit of blue. And this is all for those shadows. And the masking fluid helps to protect all of our. Once we're done blocking in the gray, you want to let your painting dry. And then we'll take off the masking fluid before we start painting in the clothes and the hair of the kiddos. So when you're taking off masking fluid, you want to use a rubber cement eraser, or sometimes you can use your finger very carefully, but you want to make sure that your painting is completely dry, or else a lot of times what can happen is it will rip your paper. So I'm going to go ahead and take off my masking fluid just by roughly going side to side, and then we'll talk about the next step. So once you take off your masking fluid, a lot of times, like if I look and some of my highlights are too bright and they're taking over like kind of the focus of the painting, you can always come back on top with a thin layer of your ocean color or even another color and go over the masking fluid. It won't get rid of it completely, but some areas it'll help just to tone it down a little bit. And then the last thing we'll do is filling in our kiddos. So for like hair, you typically want to do like the lightest color in the hair first. Like for her, if I wanted to give her brown hair, I would do like a lighter brown first. And then I could use a darker brown like burnt umber to flick in on top. And that just gives her hair, you know, a little bit more dimension than just doing one flat color. You can also do that with like one color. Like if I did, you know, just different layers of like a yellowy color, I could do a really thin wash of that yellow and then just use more paint and less water to do another layer of that same color. But when I use less water, it makes it just a little bit darker. You can apply the same concept to the skin tone. Now I could just leave it flat, and if I had shaded using the ink pen, that can kind of give me that depth on them. Or I could take, you know, burnt sienna, maybe with a little less water than what I had used for their skin. And then I could do a shadow to one side of their leg. Think about, you know, if they're wearing something that has sleeves, typically you'll have a shadow underneath the sleeve a little bit. And that's some subtle ways that you can kind of add a little bit of depth. Last thing you want to work on is, you know, finishing up the kiddos, painting their clothes. You can always continue darkening and doing more layers on things. Like here it's kind of boring, not have much texture, so I could always just dry brush another layer of that same blue. But with the clothing, so if I wanted to have like stripes, what I would do is, so I'm going to pretend that on her I'm doing like a white shirt with stripes, just because it'll be easier time-wise to show y'all how to do the stripes. But what I would want to do first is, like, if I wanted it to be yellow with red stripes, I would paint the whole shirt yellow, because yellow is a lighter color than red. So if I was doing it the opposite, and maybe it's yellow stripes on a red shirt, I would probably paint it all yellow and then paint bigger amounts of red on top. But if I wanted this to be white, I would probably paint a gray shadow on the shirt so it doesn't feel completely flat. And then for the stripes, what I would do is I would do a thin layer of whatever color you want your stripes to be. And then again, you gotta think about, if I want it to look three-dimensional, I need to have a different value. So I could use that same color, but with less water on one side, you know, or even like where the shirt is curving away from the light. That's another way to add that shape. With red, you could also use like alizarin or things like that. But I'm thinking about, okay, how the shirt is laying on her and how, like, okay, over here is gonna be a little darker. I think it might be too wet now. And then same thing goes to other objects, like the bucket. I would do one flat color and then just use the same color but with less water to add a bit of a shadow right where it meets her leg, because it's going to put it away from the light. It's going to be a little bit darker. So, and that's how you want to treat each of these. Fabric's a little bit different. Like if you want something with more like ruffles, like if this, I was trying to do those gray shadows on the ruffly shirt, you know, you're more just painting in those gray like shadow shapes and lines rather than trying to do smooth areas.